Good evening, my friends. Welcome to our Wednesday night gathering together, and I just want to encourage you just to kind of really enter into this moment and just take a moment to have like a little bit of a conscious intention just to let the day just kind of fall away. Sometimes the breath can help with that. Just a couple of nice, and just that feeling of, just that kind of feeling of things dropping away a little bit, right? So we're entering into this space together. So as we get going, I want to just have a little intention here. Let's just to kind of get just in touch with your being, but in this sense, let's just say with your body, right? So, because when I'm going to talk, it's a particular kind of skill to learn. I learned it when I was sort of with my teacher. At first I would listen like I would listen at school, let's say. Your ears are open, you're taking in information, you're trying to learn something. We all, I think, know what that's like. And so that when I came in and listened to spiritual lectures, I would listen kind of like that. I didn't know that I was doing that. I wasn't real conscious of it. I wasn't analyzing it. But at some point I recognized I was sort of listening only with my ears, sort of from my neck up. And when I recognized that, I just had sort of an inquiry. What would it be like since our whole body is a sensing instrument, if you think about it, this is how existence connects with itself, or you could say this is how we connect with the world and experience it. Our whole entire bodies, right? You sense things at the bottom of your feet, right? If you step on a rock, you feel that. So I started to have this intention, not to certainly listen the old way, but also to include, like, what would it be like what would it be like to listen with my whole body? And at first it was a little awkward. I didn't quite know what that even meant. But I just lived with the question. What would it be like to listen with this whole body? And somewhere in that process, I remember it sparked a kind of memory. It sparked a memory of some of the many, many times I was way out in the Sierra Nevada mountains backpacking when I was young. And so many days, you hike for 3 or 4 or 5 hours and then stop and for lunch, and often I'd be laying out on some sort of granite rock, soaking in some sun and eating and drinking and just kind of getting rejuvenated for the afternoon. And when I would be laying out on that rock, I could hear the breeze in the trees and the stream flowing just a little bit down below. And I could feel the slight breeze on my face and my arms, and I could feel the sun sort of baking my body. And so that memory came up, and I recognized, like, oh, I know how to listen with my whole body. I've done it many, 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 many. It's kind of the way that I move when I'm backpacking out in the wilderness. And so that's when, all the senses were sort of turned on and bright and aware and functioning. And I thought, what if I brought that kind of, high Sierras, backpacking kind of listening when you're out there, just laying there in the afternoon, recovering, and just your whole senses are taken up in the environment. And when I started to listen to like Dharma lectures like that, they made it. It was such an amazing impact. I understood them deeper, and different parts of me understood parts of the lecture. Like, say, some parts of me would go, oh, I understand that. It's kind of an intellectual part. Sometimes I would understand something, but it wouldn't be with the mind. And I would be like, oh, it seems like my gut understands that. What is that my gut understands? And maybe over time that would get translated into a kind of thought or an insight. But so I just want to encourage you, you might have your own memory of what it's like to sit and listen in this whole-bodied, sort of easy, relaxed way. You know, as if we were all just resting under the sun in on a grassy knoll or something. You know, that kind of feeling, because then we're really quite open. We're really very much in a sort of meditative mind, right? Which is a very open mind, a mind that doesn't feel that it needs to make, conclusions too quickly, or judgments too quickly. That it just sort of allows things in, allows the moment in. And this is really the essence, of course, of meditation, right? It's exposing ourselves to the moment in a conscious way, right? I'm going to just sit down and open. And of course, right here is where so many meditators, there's this, it's a very innocent thing. We could call it an innocent mistake. I did it myself. But you can sit down to meditate, and if you're not careful, it can kind of become this fairly quickly a kind of cerebral event, because you sit down and you go, okay, this is what I want to happen, or this is a meditative state I'm going to try to get into. Not that you're necessarily saying these things in your head, but we're often acting that way. And so we're trying to do this whole thing where we're trying to adjust ourselves into the meditative mindset, and we're preparing, and there's this whole thing that can happen. But when you've walked a few hours out in the mountains and you just lay down in the grass or on a warm rock and you just take in the sun and you feel that breeze and you hear that stream or you hear the birds here or there, and your senses are just naturally open, right? There's not some big preparation thing we have to do to get there. It's just, and we open and we open. And it's like we let the outside world in, right? In meditation, it's still good to open this way. It's fine to let the outside world in, but we're really letting the inside world just arise more into its own consciousness. So that's sort of a little or a long introduction to different ways of listening. And the reason I emphasize this is because what I found is the quality with which we listen or engage in anything, right? It could be anything, really dictates how much we receive back from it, right? And this could go for a Dharma lecture. It could go for anything you do, any task around the house, any job. That when we really open ourselves to what we're doing, those are the moments when we tend to also receive, and sometimes in some quite unexpected ways. And of course, if we can listen from a quiet mind, remembering that we can always go back and get our analytical mind making its critiques and judgments. We can always do that later if we want to do that, which is totally fine if we feel that's necessary. But in the moment, just opening the whole body, listening with the body, and don't even worry if you think you understand what that means, or if you feel quite confused, like, what does he mean listening with the whole body? It's really listening with all your senses. And if you just hold that intention over the days, it will start to clarify for you what that means, because it's actually not very complicated. We do it often without knowing, like I said, when we lay down in some really relaxed way, or have you ever just like sat outside protected from the rain, and or inside, and you're just listening to the raindrops fall? And you're not listening to the raindrops fall in a particularly analytical way. Your analytical mind is not leading then. It's part of the picture, but a much bigger spectrum of your being is involved in something as simple as listening to raindrops. Actually, that's how I came to this kind of listening, because it was raining at the same time my teacher was giving a Dharma lecture. And I recognized that I was listening to the rain in a little bit different way than I was listening to her speaking. I noticed there was a part of me that was listening to her speaking like you'd normally listen to a lecture or something if you're in school or whatever. But I would keep getting I'd noticed this, she had this roof with, I don't think there was much insulation, so the raindrops were quite loud. And I noticed I listened to them in this like really delightful, open, expansive way, because we just meditated. And it was almost like the rain was just following through me. And at that moment I thought, what if I listened to her speak in the same way I'm listening to the raindrops fall on the roof? And that was when I first started to discover this other way of listening. And I discovered, wow, when we listen with the whole being, we're engaging so much more of ourselves. And yet we're rarely really encouraged to do that. We're usually encouraged, just listen with your ears, and it starts there. But, everything you hear, it feels a certain way in your heart, feels a certain way in your tummy, your whole being. So anyway, just think of your whole body-mind as a sort of sensing instrument, in a way, for the divine, or for life, if you will. That's how existence experiences itself, through these senses, right? So this afternoon, I was sitting down and reading some of the questions y'all sent in. There was a whole pile of questions, as there often is. So thank you for all those. But I was really sort of intrigued right off the bat with the first question. I found really quite delightful, and it sort of is this way of there's so much potential kind of teaching, inside of this question, because there's certain parts that are, there's certain parts of any of our experience that's sort of, at least it feels quite subjective, quite unique to us. And yet so often when we tap into I think the deeper dimensions of our being, we start to run into experiences that are quite much more universal. Boy, that's sort of very interesting. So I want to kind of go through, I want to start with one of these questions and just sort of add some commentary, because I thought there was quite a few interesting points. And this was sent in by Mark. And Mark ended this with, any insights or guidance would be greatly appreciated. Lots of love, Mark. So thank you for that, Mark. I appreciate it. So I want to go through Mark's email. Dear Aja, during a recent awakening experience, it was seen that my thoughts, too, are manifestations of the one being. This showed me that I have no pride in any spiritual attainment and no shame or guilt for past actions. Life alone is happening. How could a separate self be ashamed or prideful of it being lived? It's interesting. that everything at the most fundamental level, when we bump into that fundamental level, we do experience that wow, everything is arising from this fundamental level of being, right? What does that mean? Well, in terms of like what Mark was, alluding to here, that even things like our thoughts, where do our thoughts issue from? When you meditate, it's not and after a while you start to notice your thoughts are arising without your permission, whether you want them or not. And there's often when you're meditating, there's no sense that you are personally creating them. They're just flowing, they're just coming in, right? They're just flowing in. And so in one sense, that's what Mark's getting at, noticing, like, we think that these things are sort of personally produced, right? I'm personally manufacturing all my thoughts. I'm personally manufacturing my feelings. I'm personally manufacturing all these things. And yet when our insight starts to get deeper, we start to have this sense and this feeling that's actually everything is arising from something, or much of what's arising for us is arising from a source that we're kind of unconscious until there's an arising, right? Something manifests. Oh, there's a thought, there's a feeling, and the ego tends to take these things as credit or blame, right? That's my thought, I produce that. If it's a good thought, we love it. If it's an awful thought, we feel ashamed, or we don't want anybody to know we thought such a terrible thought, or whatever it might be. And there's a pressure with that, right? Because our egos are taking ownership, and there's a pressure there can be pride if things are going well, and there can be a lot of, shame and worse when we're not thinking what we think we would be thinking, or who knows what it is that's happened. But when we start to get that it's like life is living itself through each of these body minds, right? And yet, there's a yet, right? Because it's not quite that simple. We'll get back to that and yet in a little bit. For now, we'll just stop there because I want to continue. Continuing with the email. Since then, I've noticed that the mind now is feeling a little unsure of how to be. Each thought is recognized as not my thought, but instead just thought. As thought is inherently dualistic, I can't seem to see the use of any of it, especially when I'm alone. It seems now that all thought is a trick trying to get me to identify with again, to return to identification with the dream character. Let's look at this. It'll progress beyond this, but I just want to take this paragraph too. And there's some things, I like this because Mark is articulating certain insights, and also articulating the fact that whether we know we're doing it or not, whether we want to do it or not, we are almost instantly interpreting our experience, right? The mind interprets every experience we have almost. And I like how he starts. Since then, I've noticed the mind is now feeling a little unsure of how to be. A mind that was convinced that it was a mind. Now I'm saying in a kind of personal sense. Let's call it the me mind, right? When the me mind was kind of convinced at some level that it was, taking praise or blame for whatever happened, and to recognize that there's a different order of reality where it's almost something like life is generating these things, right? Each thought is recognized, as Mark says, as not my thought, but instead just thought. When we actually recognize that, it's very freeing. Because my thought has an energy to it, right? There can be praise, there can be blame, you can have shame, all that orbits around the belief that these are my thoughts, in the sense that somehow I'm generating them. When we kind of see that actually They're just thoughts. They're just thoughts arising. They're not my thoughts necessarily at this level of being. They're not somebody else's thoughts. They're just thoughts arising and in this body mind, right? And if they're not mine, right, with that identification, they have so much less charge because they're just thoughts. Like, oh, that's a nice pleasant thought. Oh, that's a quite dark thought. And most thoughts are, something quite in between. But whether they're really light or really, really dark, when we're not grasping out and taking that personal ownership, it kind of allows the whole stream of thinking. We just see it like a stream. It's less personal. It's less self-defining, right? Because we tend to self-define through the quality and the types of our thinking. And to start to see that, oh, it's not really my thinking. It's thinking. Of course, all these insights can be taken to an extreme where they start to turn in their own delusions. We'll talk about that in a moment. But for just this moment, this is a really nice insight. And it's worth exploring, like when you meditate, changing the relationship between my thoughts to it's just thought. It's just thought. It doesn't, the thought isn't aggrandizing you. If it's a scary thought, it's not diminishing you because it's just thought. You're not even consciously attempting to create in any way, right? It's just happening. And this is something that meditation shows us. At first, it can be a little disorienting to see how much thought and feeling actually just happens. And we often kept thinking we were like the conscious author of all these things. And then we sit and meditate for a while and we realize like, wow, the inner environment is not completely unlike the outer environment. Of course, these are distinctions that our mind makes up. But in the sense that, when you're in the outer environment, things happen. The breeze comes, it blows the trees, the rain happens. You might like it, you might not like it, but you don't take it personally. Like, what did I do wrong because it's raining, or something like that. So we have a little more impersonal relationship with what goes on in the world around us, the natural world. If we could take that sort of inside to our inner terrain, which is also the natural world, actually, that same sort of feeling, like nature. Oh, your body-mind is as much nature as anything else out there that's nature. A tree, a plant, a deer, a bird, those are all nature. Your body-mind's nature as well. So to just see that stream of thought, and as we take it less personally, it can start to resolve. All on its own in a way. Okay. I'm just going to repeat this paragraph. Since then, I've noticed that the mind now is feeling a little unsure of how to be, a little disoriented probably. Each thought is recognized as not my thought, but instead just thought. As thought is inherently dualistic, which it is, I can't seem to see the use for any of it. Now, I think that was just sort of in the moment, right? Because we use thought if we didn't have any thought at all, we would basically be like infants that don't think. They're not thinking either, at least not symbolic thought, which is not really what we want. We actually want to transform our whole relationship with thought, because thought is a powerful tool, very, very powerful tool. And yet, until we kind of wake up from that ego identification, that tool it's working for us, but it's working against us just about as much often, because we just don't. We know how to use the tool in a scholastic way, the way we were taught, in school to solve problems. But for all the other thoughts that bang around in our heads, which are probably 90%, we weren't taught how to be with any of that or what any of it means, right? So sure, it's great to get all the personal identification out of thinking, right? And a vast amount of thinking that we do, we don't need it. Actually, it gets in the way. We overthink so much. In fact, most people are sitting around thinking when they have absolutely nothing to do. And the thing just kind of keeps going and going and going and going. So, as I suggested, there's something, this can be taken too far, but we'll get to that too. I'm going to continue here. Mark continues, I know thought has a use. See, already, boom, Mark's kind of coming back into that more balanced view here. I know thought has a use, and an ego is useful if not identified with. But thought is still speaking in ways that is clearly divisive. In quotes, me, my, you, him, her, them, they, continues to speak to itself in this way, even though its unreal nature has been seen quite a few times. Well, Mark and everybody else that's ever listening or had some sort of profound insight, this is as common, as breathing, sort of. There are those thoughts. They can be the me thoughts. They can be different kinds of conditioned thoughts, issues that can come up. That these, when we awaken, it's not like all that just completely disappears. I suppose that's the fantasy that plenty of people have. Like, I'm going to have an awakening, and every unpleasant thought and thing is just going to magically just disappear forever and ever and ever. And there's some truth to that, at least in my experience. Certain things do just kind of disappear. Right? Insight can have that quality. It's like the old metaphor is used. When you turn a light on in a dark room, it's just boom, it's light. It's no longer dark. It doesn't kind of go from dark to light. It just goes light dark or dark light. And so, of course, thought has a use, which is Mark recognizes that. It's the even as he says ego. The whole issue here is the identification. See, it's not about getting rid of the thoughts that you don't like or anything else really. It's the identification, whether it's with thought or with ego. See, people are so often battling to get rid of their ego when they realize it's not really your ego that's the real problem here. It's the identification, right? That everything about the ego structure becomes me, rather than, there's this kind of ego structure through which something can operate, whether it's your spirit or your conditioning, or lots of things can operate through it, right? But the problem in the end of the day isn't necessarily with the ego per se. It's really with the identification with it. When we see through the identification, well, that's a pretty immense insight. It can sound kind of small in description, but it's pretty immense when the thing that we thought was defining you your whole life, and then you see, actually, no, the ego's, it's a phenomena in my mind. Yes, it's there, right? It kind of interfaces with the world. And yet, it doesn't need to be identified in the sense of, this is telling me who I am. It's telling you maybe some of the qualities of your ego, but maybe not even that, because, well, that's a whole other story. But that's a little bit of the disorientation Mark talked about earlier too, that when that's no longer defining us, to consciousness, it's a little bit like, whoa, a little disorienting. It's freeing. It's quite lovely. Of course, your thoughts could get back in there and use that experience to scare you with, but that would be simply another thought interpretation. But even without that, there's almost always a kind of period of a little disorientation, And you might not, okay, now how do I use this thing called thought? Because now you start to see it more as a tool than an enemy, than this thing that's always disturbing you and you're trying to quiet down. But it's like, there's also thought as a creative tool. It's not a good tool to identify with, but it's a pretty creative tool to have. I think that's fairly self-evident. Okay, let's go along, Mark. Here's Mark's next paragraph. My question is this: I'm wondering if the process continues in the same way that it is done up until this point. Basically, I'm assuming there just has to be a clear scene of truth. Then, with that clear scene, the ego trick simply loses its power to tempt more and more. Is that correct? Partly, Mark. And when I say partly, I don't mean to underemphasize the importance of what you stated, because that is important. I'm assuming that there has to be a clear scene of the truth. Then, with that clear scene, the ego trick simply loses its power to tempt more and more, and that is true. And we do. There is seen something clear, and then there's seen something more clear, and then there's seen something more clear. I had my first big opening at 25 years old, and I'm still seeing it more clearly to this day. It's and then there were other big openings after that, but it's not like they're just monoliths in the past, that just like an event that happened and then that's just it. They were doors opening into living insights. And I think that's important to understand about insights. If you let them, they can be living, they can be alive. They don't have to be fixed, right? Like, this is the insight I had, and this is what it said, and this is true in all situations at all. And there can be a way in which we kind of can fixate around a particular insight. But there can be also another way where we value the insight, but we don't kind of concretize around it. And then it can keep deepening and clarifying and getting clear. The same thing can be seen deeper and clear and clear. But if we assume, I've already seen that, we're probably not going to be in that process of seeing it deeper and deeper and deeper, and we're going to get hung up because there's some identification with, I've got that, I've done that, I know that, you can just feel the energy of that. It's quite egoic, right? So when it's open-ended, yes, you see things more clearly, and over time, as that clarity gets deeper and deeper and deeper, the mind's tendency to its stickiness, thought's stickiness, because that's really what I'm talking about, not the presence or absence of thought, but it's the stickiness, right? The thoughts that kind of adhere to you, and they, those often the old conditioned kind of thoughts. I'm going to keep going. This is the last paragraph from Mark. In my nightmare dreams now, I am confronted with darker and much more strange aspects of myself. I'm taking that as a positive thing. I'm interpreting that as I am unlocking aspects of being that have been suppressed, repressed, rejected, or closed off. Right on the money, Mark. Absolutely. That's often what will happen. However, sexual addiction seems to be an aspect that shows up regularly. I'm assuming that what I'm being shown is that my mind will tempt me away from the truth of unity by tempting me with sexual experiences. Hopefully, like the rest of my personal will, the ability of such temptations will pull me into separation will diminish. Any insights or guidance would be greatly appreciated, Mark. All this is very common, Mark. That doesn't mean it's always all easy, but there is this, I call it the honeymoon phase of awakening. Things open up, and it's different for different people. The honeymoon phase can last a few seconds to months. And the honeymoon phase is some version of things are just flowing and simple and, flowing and simple, right? The insight can just be flowing and simple and all of that. And then there comes a time. Then we kind of come back from the honeymoon, which doesn't mean we come back to all the identified mind state we had necessarily or any of that. Can be, but doesn't need to be. when we come back from that honeymoon, then our psyche, it's kind of there waiting for us, right? And since we've also opened certain doors of repression without even knowing it inside the mind, inside the emotional body. There's certain doors that get open with awakening that we don't even know at the time. And then, like Mark says, all of a sudden he's having some more darker nightmares and stuff. And right away, I'm interpreting that as unlocking aspects of my being that have been suppressed, repressed, rejected, or closed off. That's often what happens. We all have the light and the dark, right? We tend to think, we have all been conditioned to the hilt to think of like the dark stuff as, all like the evil stuff we see in horror movies, or some version, and if it's a personal version, we just don't think of the dark has this quite negative connotation. But it's not really necessary. It can be some scary stuff, and some unusual, surprising stuff can come out of that darker part of our psyche. But it doesn't necessarily mean bad. Right? It's just the light and dark. Everybody has these aspects in their being. Nobody's all light. Just doesn't work that way. Being all light would actually cut a lot of your potential off, and even sort of some of the power that drives awake. Because where does awakening come from? It comes from the deep, dark, unknown spots of your psyche, the unknown. Not dark in the sense of menacing or evil or any of that. That's our conditioned view of it, of the dark stuff. But I mean the unknown, the deep, deep unknown dimension of the psyche. That's what's leaping from the deepest, the core dimension of us out. And that that opens some doors. And it's very, 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 very common that after awakening, that you get confronted with some of the little darker stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean it's scary. Sometimes it's a little scary, but sometimes it's just stuff that you would rather go like, wow, I'd really rather just not deal with it, or pretend like that a thought like that isn't inside me, or a feeling like that. Or, I've had people say, God, I've had this awakening, and yet last night I had this absolutely horrendous, terrible thought, and they're kind of upset about it. And I'll say, just relax. Just relax. This is part of not the moment of awakening, but this is like the process of awakening after the moment. And those unresolved pockets, some of them will come up. It doesn't mean everything in your life that's ever scared you or is unresolved will come up. That's not the way just often what needs to be clarified a bit more. Or accepted, right? Or accepted. Can I say this? Yeah. And various, like Mark mentioned, sexual addiction and stuff like that. That's quite common. I hear about that a lot too. And that's along this. These are the things that will kind of become highlighted. There's an intelligence sort of underneath this, almost like saying, "Hey, there's a big insight, and that's legitimate, and it's beautiful, and it's life changing." And that true nature, it has its agenda. That's a way of thinking about it. You can have your minds, what you want, and what you want out of your awakening, or just that more personal perspective. Whereas true nature's agenda is to be as awake and conscious to this life as it can be. And it's going to clean out. It's going to do house cleaning after awakening too. People think, oh, it's just before awakening. No, it's afterwards too. It's different afterwards. It's different. Hopefully we've seen enough of the more impersonal nature of a lot of this internal unfolding that we don't take it so personally. And when we don't take it so personally, then it can come up and we're not like horrified by it, or we're not, oh, I like that, or we're not grasping it. We're just, the psyche is just sort of unloading itself. And the more we're kind of in the position like, okay, it gets to unload itself. It gets to show me whatever it wants to show me, right? But the trick is not to deny it, but also not to grab onto it and think that defines me. That's who I am, right? Not that either. This is, think of it as almost like phenomena that's moving through, that wants to be let go, so that you more of that true nature can shine brighter and clear, right? And that's kind of the process. That makes it sound quite sort of simple, straightforward, and it can be, and some of it is quite simple and straightforward. And there can also be those aspects that, especially the things that kind of, if you get clues on, there's things that are really repeating here. And they're repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. And those are things that, if something repeats, even though you've kind of seen through certain parts of it or the impersonal nature of it, or you're not as identified with it, but if it just keeps recycling and recycling, that's kind of true nature's way of saying, hey, let's just hold that in our vision for a while, in our view. Right? Because maybe it wants to be seen more than, oh, it's just passing. So we just really let things that just repeat and repeat and repeat. It's a good idea to have that intention of, let me look into this a little more deeply. Is there something here that I need to see? And you ask it. And then you be quiet. Is there something here I need to see? What do I need to see? What might I be afraid of seeing? You know, there's these questions that can come from you. I'm just generating a few of them that can help you kind of get into some of these areas, again, that are repeating. The ones that aren't repeating, that kind of come through and they're off, don't worry about them. But the repeating ones, just take a little more time. And remember, when you're really looking at something, we have this conditioning that, we're going to look at something, we go immediately to the analytical mind. There's a time for analyzing something in that way, of course, but spiritually speaking, the first thing we're attempting to do, let's say with these more persistent sort of conditioned aspects, is get more consciousness into them. An insight is nothing more than you've gotten enough consciousness into something where it goes, aha, you have a different way of understanding it. And the way that reason that burst forth is you went over sort of a critical edge of enough consciousness got in, so all of a sudden you saw it differently. So when things come up, like the first thing is just let the light of consciousness rest with them. And the questions are not meant to get your analytical mind cranked up again. The questions that you might ask, like, what do I need to see, or what am I afraid of seeing, or whatever it might be, the questions are to kind of bring more presence, more consciousness, more of your light to bear upon that. Just exposing it, like you would in the old days when there were things like dark rooms for cameras and you exposed, the film, right? In this sense, we're kind of exposing certain aspects of our being to the light of our being and letting that interaction happen. Okay. And of course, if there are things that are very persistent or certainly very problematic, then we might need a little help in delving into those even deeper. So thank you, Mark. I not only it was very, very clear for what you were trying to communicate. It was a page and a half, which was short given all that you said. So I appreciate you being so succinct. And you do have some clarity on these issues, maybe just a little lighter. Just, Because eventually we live in this paradox when the insight gets deep, mature. There's this kind of paradox where we're not taking like the personal ownership of all this stuff, where it's the thoughts or the feelings or even our memories of the past or whatever they may be. We're not doing that. However, I remember earlier I said we can take some insights, and if we push them too far, they can become sort of delusions. So if the only way we ever relate to any thought or feeling or anything is some version, well, that's not mine, right? And I let it go. And there, if we just do that, that can start to turn into a kind of form of denial, like where we're denying whatever comes up in ourselves when it's something other than we want to see, right? Oh, that's just the display of the totality, Anytime we notice we're landing on a kind of part of a dualistic view, right? An opposite view, like there's self or no self. Which is it? In the end, even though sometimes I'll emphasize no self very heavily, but in the end, it's not about going from self to its extreme, no self, and then becoming just as sort of stuck there as we were stuck on selfhood. You see, so this is the thing where I say even insights. You can have an amazing insight, but your mind is going to interpret it in some way. And if it interprets it in this more tight way, kind of fundamentalist way, in a way, right? Even our own insights, we can relate to them in a fundamentalist way. Like, okay, that's it. And I got it. And damn it, that's the only truth there is. And well, now you become an awake fundamentalist in a way. I've met quite a few of them, by the way. They're particularly annoying to me, honestly. But there's something else, and this is always the harder thing to describe. If we take the polarities, self and selflessness, and we realize, well, the idea isn't, in the end of the day, to go from one extreme to the other. We probably will go to the other extreme because that's just the way our psyche often does insights. It's like we don't actually often go from one position right to the balanced middle view. It's often from here and we go a little bit over here. We can get stuck there, then we become a fundamentalist. Or kind of comes back. And this is like a symbol of our insight, actually. And our insight ideally would land somewhere in the middle where, yes, all this is ultimately quite selfless. And there's obviously a particular human being that experiences the world in a very particular way, not exactly like anybody else. That particular human being does have a past. He or she doesn't need to be overly identified with it. That'll cause problems, but neither should they just completely dismiss it, right? It's just there, right? It doesn't need to be identified with, but it's happened. So a lot of, and then it's hard for, well, where does my mind grasp? Self or selfness? Me or no me? And again, with some maturity and the intention to just keep letting our own insight mature, it's like they all come together. And I don't have a word for that, where they come together. Or self and selflessness are not even the correct way to view these things. There's something else. I think it's really what the Buddha meant by the middle way, which I don't think at all was this sort of compromise between opposites. I actually think it was, here's a duality, one side of the duality, another side of duality, But there's this bigger, more comprehensive view that contains both of them, contains selfhood, contains no self, and yet it's bigger. And there's no word for that. And yet, as we begin to experience that, and we notice, we feel that we are not just moving from one dualistic viewpoint to another, even though that's often part of the journey, but we start to realize we're not actually trying to go from one extreme to the other. The truth lies, you can either see it as deeper or more inclusive, right? More expansive. But it's something that when all that comes down into your life, my life, what does that mean in a life that's actually lived? Something like, and I say something like because to say it's an approximation is an understatement, but something like we're just living a knowing, and it's a wonderful knowing that there's the totality. There's this totality, whatever we want to call the totality. If we want to call it something religious, we can call it something like God, or there's a million Brahman. There's a whole lot of names, Godhead, whatever. If we're not sort of looking at through those religious sort of view lens, we could just think of it as life, the totality of life. However you want to think of the immense totality of life. And the life itself is actually the author of everything that's going on here, ultimately. And that's so freeing as a sort of undertone knowing, right? And with that undertone knowing that everything's really an expression of the whole and just a kind of spontaneous flow of the whole. But that's not the whole end of the story. That whole can also manifest as this experience we have, this experience of particularity. And particularity doesn't need to be experienced through an ego lens necessarily. It can just be, it's just, notice that this is how life manifests here, expresses itself here. And that itself has a sort of uniqueness to each of us, right? It's not, one manifestation is not exactly the same as the other manifestation. And even though the ultimate author is the totality, we're simultaneously have a kind of responsibility for caring for this one. So I don't imagine I've explained that well. I've given my best attempt, but just holding the idea that in the end, it's not really about even going from self to no self. Or all these different sort of leaps. These leaps often happen, and we often emphasize the opposite of one thing in order to dislodge the stuck point where it is. But at least for me, my point was never to dislodge, one sticking point, let's say on self, and then have it go right to no self, and then that become the new identity or the new fixed point, which it can become actually. And that might happen temporarily. That often does. It's just sort of how the way our psyches develop. Often go from one extreme kind of to the other, not entirely often, but then if we're lucky or if we have good intention, something will kind of find more of its middle way in all this. So that's the tricky thing about the realm of insight, the realm of awakening, I remember saying, a couple decades ago that, every dimension of being you might end up in has its own potentialities, its own beauty, and it also has its own sort of hidden illusions in it. And there are hidden illusions in the awakened state also. And they often have to do with an over adherence to some dualistic experience or point of view that may have been experienced, and it was extremely liberating when it was experienced, but then it got grabbed onto, so it never could sort of include the totality. It could never go to that really, really, really deep view. And so I'm probably repeating myself, so it's time to move on. I'm just trying to give you the feel of some of these things, right? The sense of it. Yeah. Okay, this was sent in by, I don't know. I hope I pronounce it. Is it Chiara? Chiara. I'm terrible with figuring out how to pronounce names that I don't know. I'll go with Chiara. And Chiara, if I mispronounce your name, please accept my apologies, but I'm doing the best I can. Here we go. Dear Adya, as I practice Adya day by day and I sit quietly afterwards, as I watch forms crumble down, whenever I am able to stay with whatever that is inside and around me without running away, how can I know that what I'm doing is not the same as what all my life some part of my family has been trying to put inside my head? Rules, systems, beliefs. What I used to hear addressed as, in quotes, devil, now seems to be replaced by mind. It's a good insight. Well, in quotes, God is replaced with spirit. In other words, how do I really know that all that we allow in here isn't another form of fundamentalism dressed up as a gateway to freedom? Much love and blessings. Thanking you for your presence, Char. Thank you for this question. It's a great question. It's a great question. It can be a disquieting question, but that's why I love it. The truth is, all this stuff can become that. And it's been one of the things that I've lamented about now for a couple of decades. How, when something's new and fresh, say when kind of non-dual teachings hit in this country, in a bigger way 30 years ago or so. They were there before that, but it was much smaller. And then they get into the lexicon, right? And they get to the lexicon, and it's very easy for it to become a new form of fundamentalism. Just because it's non-duality doesn't mean it's immune from fundamentalism. I've seen massive amounts of fundamentalism in the non-dual community. And to me, it's no different than any other form. It's just, okay, here's the mind doing it in this particular domain, right? And so I love some of your, the questions. How do we know that devil now doesn't seem to be mind? Because we do talk about mind as being so problematic, right? Of course, it would take someone listening to me for a while, but I've often said, don't view your mind as the enemy. Your mind is not the enemy. Thinking it's an enemy really makes it into an even more of an enemy. Mind obviously has some problematic characteristics, right? It can sit and talk to you about things all by itself that you don't have any interest in. It can just ruminate over things that are, that are not life affirming. I think most of us know all the ways that mind can make life really difficult. But mind also is, as I was saying earlier, incredible, powerful, creative instrument, tool. So, anytime we start to see something as overly, again, those dualisms, right? Okay, mind can be problematic. Now it's the devil, or it's evil, or it's the thing we have to get rid of. Good luck getting rid of your thoughts. That's not the point. So yes, Chara, all this can move in that direction, and it can become a new belief system. It can do all that. It's subject to all those potentials. It's one of the reasons why I'm constantly saying, suggesting to me, don't turn this into a belief system. These are suggestions, they're like experiments to try out in your own, the laboratory of your own body mind. right? You do the experiment, you do the practice for a while, and then you get to decide whether it's working for you or not. If it's not working for you, don't keep doing it, or see if you're doing it the wrong way or something. But don't turn this stuff into a new belief system. Non-duality is quickly becoming the modern belief system. Not a good idea. Maybe a slight bit better where we came from, but so that puts the onus on each of us. Puts it on you, on me. I try to take as much responsibility for the very questions that Gary's asking in this email as I can. Those of you who've been listening to me for a long time have heard me address a lot of these issues and the dangers in them. And yet, the power of all this lies in the individual. It's you that turn them into a belief system or not, or become too attached to a teaching and that it becomes sort of a form of fundamentalism. It's the individuals that do that. Of course, the teachers can talk about this stuff in a way that's so strident that it can encourage that. I try not to do that, but it can happen. So you have your past. Obviously, it's influencing you in the sense you're really taking a look at these things. I think it's good you're taking a look at them in a deep way. And I also want to encourage that you will find your answers, your own answers, not mine answers, not somebody else's spiritual teacher's answers. Look at this deeply, make your own conclusion. That's my only suggestion. I'm extremely aware that everything I say. In fact, I've said in the past, you're not going to hear me tell you the truth. Because the truth is so big, it can't be just shrunk down into some little concept, some little belief system. What I try to do is help people so that they can realize the truth, not take it in as a belief. I don't care what people believe. It doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but that's not the world I'm dealing with. I'm not trying to change someone from believing into this into believing into that. I'm asking people to do something way more challenging than to go from one belief system into this new, cool Adyashanti belief system. No, we don't want to turn it into that. I'm actually putting the onus back on the individual and saying, yes, we all know these dangers are out there. These dangers are not going to be solved institutionally. They're going to be solved within you. You don't let it become fundamental. Don't let the mind grasp too hard. But also don't let it become so afraid of this stuff that you're hyper vigilant and worrying about whether you're going to fall into, some sort of trap of getting stuck somewhere. You find the balance with it. Find that balance, right? But at least for me, all my teachings, the way I see them, I can't control how other people relate to them, but the way I see them are really prompts for insight, things to look into, to spark insight within each person, right? I don't care if somebody believes what I say or not. I hope they don't believe it. I would rather them question it. I have seen, actually, in my years of being a spiritual teacher, that the people that walk in the door fall head over heels about what I'm doing immediately. I've learned that that's not always a good indication, because that means they haven't really reflected. There's some conditioned response that's just ready to jump wholeheartedly all into it. But that can be a kind of conditioning too, right? That can be a kind of conditioning too. And I've learned that that's not necessarily the most open, easy student to work with. Often, at some point, it becomes actually quite difficult. So we want to walk in with our intelligence, our discrimination, without being too afraid, realizing you get to make all the choices. It's in your hands. I like I said, I'm not trying to get anybody to believe any of this. I hope they don't. I want them to question. That's what leads to the truth. It's uncomfortable because you don't have, when you're questioning things, you don't have something else to grab onto. And when we see through one thing, there's a great tendency to want to grab onto another thing. But there's a difference between receiving some deeper insight and grabbing it and fixating it. If we receive an insight, it's like the wind hitting the sails of a boat. It just redirects your attention or your consciousness. It just sort of redirects it. And you'll feel if it gets more harmonious, more on track. You feel these things, right? So I am a very, very big, those of you who've been with me for a while, you know I'm a really big believer on finding that balance between being, open and available, not overly skeptical, but also realizing that you are allowed to retain your own intelligence. And at the end of the day, you get to make your own call. It's your life after all, right? Of what you take in, what you don't, what you accept, what you reject. It's all within the student, and that's where it belongs, right? Because if it's in the teacher, then the students are just accepting or not accepting whatever they say. There's a different relationship, right? I want my students to be vital and alive and questioning and without getting cynical and overly closed. But, there is that dynamic point where you're questioning. You can feel an energy of vitality, maybe a little bit of unease because there's not so much to hang on to. But it's that combination of an excitement when you're really questioning, a little fear because you're reaching into the unknown, right? And when you get an insight, don't concretize it. Take it in. Let it have its transforming value, whatever that might be. But let it keep breathing. Let it keep informing. Let it keep transforming. There may be much deeper insights to come. So, thank you for that. Yes. Let's go to the next one. Daizan. I hope I said that right, Daizan. Let's see. Hello, teacher. Recently, during a plant medicine ceremony, intense energies were unlocked from the lower energy centers, navel down. This is the first time on my spiritual path that I have felt a kind of fragmentation and terror where things started to feel so out of control that I thought I might actually go insane and really damage or harm myself. Before that experience, I had a strong experience of how traditions and lineages serve as anchors or guiding lights that allow us to further let go and surrender without getting lost in intense experiences. What I'm now curious about is when I was swept into this space, I felt like there was a complete loss of any support or resource from any spiritual insight, groundedness in spirit, prayer, connection to anything trustworthy and positive that has been with me so far on my path. This left this underlying new experience of fear that I might just lose it at any moment. Shortly after the experience, I felt grounded in spirit, connected to masters that have walked before me, and prayerful again. And I'm not scared of the underlying terrible feelings that have been unlocked. And I have a good sense that what I need to do is carefully, listen to this. I have a good sense that what I need to do is carefully, bit by bit, invite these energies up, and that I can do so with developing a deeper sense of patience and gentleness in the process. Still, I would like you to share on this topic, as I know you have had many challenges after your ego death experience. Could you also talk about what is the difference between a spiritually significant and positive ego death experience and an experience that is just too much and can potentially send a person into a deeply disassociative and or psychotic state with deep love and appreciation, Daizan? Thank you for this, Daizan. It's a timely question, as all sorts of different hallucinogenic drugs and plant medicines and all sorts of stuff have sort of reemerged. I kind of feel like it's a little bit like the '60s all over again with the drug stuff, but I know it's a little different angle and everything. I think it's a bit more serious now, which is a good thing. But what Daizan really talks about here, if we go back to the beginning, during a plant medicine ceremony, felt some kind of fragmentation and tear where things started to feel so out of control, I thought I might actually go insane and really damage or harm myself. What a powerful drug does is it takes the whole thing out of your hands. That's what it does. That is the beauty of it, and that's the potential danger of it. It's both. The beauty of it, it can take it out of your hands. So your hesitations, your doubts, your conditionings, your holding ons, basically can mean nothing. Like this, whatever that unfolding is going to be under that experience, it's going to happen no matter what in some circumstances, right? You're not going to be able to change the orientation. And so that's why people often use these things, right? So that their own blocks don't sort of get in the way. So something bigger and stronger than them can take them beyond them. Okay, in a certain sense, all well and good, if that goes well and good. It doesn't always go well and good. You can have everything just yanked away from you, and you can feel there's no control in this whatsoever. And that can just be really, really, really terrifying. I think you experience a fair amount of that fear yourself, Daizan. I know at that very moment, people would be going, oh, just let go into ego of death, let go. Okay, great. If that goes well, good. And yet I've met plenty of the people coming to me where that didn't go well. So I have a little bit of I'm glad there's a lot more research going on. I think, to me, the biggest aspect of all the research that's being done is the potential it might help with people who have sort of untreatable depression issues and some anxiety issues, different issues that are just untreatable sometimes. Some of these plant medicines, if they're done in an actual professional manner, can have shown to be helpful. But there's also dangers with them, and I don't think the dangers are emphasized enough. I don't mean to scare anybody, but I've always chosen to be truthful. And I've seen plenty of people who it's just been too much. And it kind of fractures their mind, and they come back, and it comes back together, and, okay, but they're terrified, or they're scared of opening because they think opening is going to be associated with the same way it is on the drug experience. And spiritual openings without drug enhancement they feel different. They feel somewhat different. They can be challenging at times still, but they're different. So I'm very well aware of the help that people have gotten. I've met hundreds of people that kind of had some sort of drug experience as what I'd call a door opener. It showed them what was possible and potential, and that helped them get into a deeper form of spirituality. So, I could go on and on and on, but that's not really my area of expertise. It's not really, I don't really want to go on and on with it. However, at the end of this, to get to Daizan's question, could you talk a little bit about the difference between a spiritually significant and positive ego death experience and an experience that is too much and can potentially send a person into disassociative and psychotic states? There's a reason that traditionally, and I mean over generations and generations and generations who've done this stuff for a long, long, long time, right? In those traditions, those mystical traditions, all of them have basically come out and talked about the importance of certain kind, a grounding. And in spirituality, there's certain kind of spiritually grounding, exercises. I think that's often why a lot of yoga was developed, to open up energetic pathways. So when energy does get evoked, it's a little more open and it can move freely. And there was all these preliminary practices, which today nobody wants to do any preliminary practice. They just like, just get me to the top of the mountain, man. And I understand that, but it's a very sort of modern mindset, and it doesn't pay respect, really, to the subtleties of the human psyche. And the subtleties of the human psyche, then things get a little bit more complex. If you're ready to have your ego blasted into oblivion, great. When it happens, you're all right. It's still going to be a heck of a ride. If you're not, it can be utterly terrifying. So I'm not the kind of teacher that likes to tell people what to do or not to do, and I'm not even sure in this whole realm anymore, because I've seen people that have been really, really helped by plant medicine, and I've also seen people that have been really, really hurt by it. And I know every time I mention this to teachers that use plant medicine, they never want to hear anything about it. And to me, that's very disturbing. There should be a place where the challenges that come up in plant medicine usage or drug usage, they need to be talked a lot more. There needs to be a lot more honesty about what's going on out there. Because like I said, I often see, I've seen hundreds of people that have been helped. I have to admit that. And it's been really wonderful. And I'm glad they've been helped by it. And I've also met a lot of people who really just had the shit scared out of them. And so just be intelligent. Don't assume that you're ready. Be very patient. Be careful. Be careful about your settings, your preparation. And don't think that this is going to be the golden way to enlightenment. It's not. It opens doors. That can be nice. But enlightenment is not an altered state of It's not an altered state. It's not like being on any drug I've ever been on. It's nothing like it. And I've had not unitive experiences in my 20s, with the drug, mushrooms or whatever it was. And then when I had it without that, when it just came on its own, there's some similarities, but it's not the same. It's not exactly the same. The goal isn't to have a consciousness that feels like you're on the drug all the time. So the people who have gotten insights and really good things with them and helped them with all manner of things, wonderful. I'm really happy for you. I do believe there's some great and amazing potential in all this. I think a lot more research needs to be done, right? It's too haphazard for my feeling right now. So ego death experiences are always a little bit shocking. But when they kind of happen naturally without a chemical prompt, see, this is the thing about a chemical or a plant. They tend to not have a sense of timing. Is this a good timing for things to open up like this for you or not? The chemical is just like, boom, we just open it up. Ready or not, doesn't matter. It's not even thinking. That's not part of what is thinking about. It's not thinking at all, right? It's a drug, for God's sake. And so readiness is a really, really, really important part of this. And not only with the drug thing, but even awakening without it comes from meditation or inquiry or anything. It's one of the reasons I tell people, when people would come to retreats with me, and they were retreating, sitting many periods of meditation during the day. And many retreats, I would say, I don't have you sitting here meditating necessarily so you can become really good at it. That's not, if you do, great, that's really nice. But that's not the reason. There's two reasons, I say. One reason is when you sit down and meditate daily, whether you want to or not, you have a sort of forced confrontation with what's actually happening inside of you, right? A truth confrontation for 30 minutes or whatever it may be. It's easy to bullshit yourself when you're walking around talking to yourself about highfalutin spiritual things. It's a lot harder when you're sitting on the cushion and your mind is driving you crazy. Whatever your high-minded ideas kind of fall apart. So meditation kind of like as a mirror. You sit down and you look in that mirror and you just see, where am I at this exact moment in time? How am I feeling? What's going on? And you sit down and there you are. And you're mirrored with that. You're confronted with that. And that's very, very, very powerful. Because we spend so much of our time each day trying to avoid where we actually are, what we're really feeling, what we're really thinking, you know? We're distracting ourselves all the time. So meditation is great for not distracting. The other reason I tell people I have them meditating is that foundational sense. It's really good for it creates a more, if you do it correctly, that's really important. If you do it right. If you do it wrong, it can have the opposite effect. But if you do it correctly, it can create a kind of stability. A kind of psychic stability, even bodily stability, mental stability. When it's done, when it's done right, it can help with that. That's not sexy, right? That's not the stuff that gets all the light and and gets all people reading books and everything. But I'll tell you, when an opening comes, however it comes, having stability within the psyche is incredibly useful. Really, really, really useful. And I know here we're so quick to get to pluck the cherry off of anything, the best thing off of anything, that we tend to not have a lot of respect for foundations. But here I am sitting in a house. The only reason this house stands up because it has a foundation. Could have constructed it without a foundation, but it wouldn't be very long before it all fell apart. So that's part of it too. So these foundations of stability are really useful. And just recognize, I forgot the name, sorry, from the last email that I read, but just recognize that the opening of spirit, even though sometimes it can feel like your own hesitations they're not strong enough to hold back a deeper insight when it wants to arise. There are times when that does happen, and something inside you is kind of going like, whoa, this is awful big or awful strange. But it's very different than when you're on a drug. It's quite different. Both have their dangers. As I've said many times, spirituality has its dangers, right? Everything in life does. And again, that foundation is useful. Unfortunately, some of that's just so underemphasized. But, if it gets too emphasized, then all you're doing is foundation. So there's that balance between foundation and penetrating insight. But both can be utilized at the same time. And if you've ever been to a retreat with me, you see that's how I do it. That's a sort of living example. I know people aren't going to be meditating all day long, but there is some meditation, there's some inquiry, there's some Q&A. There are these things that are trying to create a container that has some groundedness to it and some high energy to it. Both. So there's something almost like pulling, metaphorically pulling from the top, but there's something also just grounded. So this higher, more intense kind of spiritual energy has a place to settle. And then you're where we began the evening with. remember my encouragement to just let the day go. Just let it wash off of you. And a particular way of listening and just being present. And so when some old conditioning connection comes up between, oh, if I spiritually open, oh my God, it reminds me of that drug experience that was really scary. Just remember, they're not the same thing. They're not the same thing. Some of the same fears can come up because you are going beyond ego. And that's always a little, that's always a little, I was going to say frightening, but it's not necessarily frightening always. It just has a kind of intensity of energy around it. Okay? So again, I'm encouraging you to, like you're doing in these letters. One of the reasons I liked, or these emails that I liked, these 3 emails that I read, it was people describing their experience, and then really looking at it, right? Taking a moment to reflect at their experience, right? Really look at it. And then, okay, is there any deeper issue here that I need to look into deeper or resolve, right? These are important steps. You have an experience, but then you reflect on it. You just let it sit there. You don't have to just leap to the first question, but let it sit there and see what issues clarify out of that. So most of the questioners that I read were doing that, which one of the reasons I really appreciated those emails. They were reaching out with questions, but they were already asking the questions and working with them inside themselves. And you know how it is. With the deepest questions, I can give responses, of course. But the real response, the responses that are going to be probably the most transformative for you are going to be the ones that come from you. I'm just trying to evoke things out of people. I'm like what do they call those? The help in birthing. I can't remember now. Not a doula, but the other one. Where you're just kind of helping bring a being into the world, right? And I kind of think as a spiritual teacher, I'm just helping birth true nature into the world. I can't create it because you already got it. I can't give it to you because you already have it. But you're probably with me or someone like me because you're a little bit spiritually pregnant in a way. Something is generating, right? Something's coming alive with all the beauty and uncomfortability that is when something new starts to come alive. And I'm kind of talking to that. Often I'm talking to people's true nature. I'm not actually talking to their minds that are asking me the questions. I'm often talking to the true nature inside of them because that is what's there. And we're just coaxing it into conscious recognition, right? Nothing's being given to somebody. It's just, you have this nature at the core of you that's just extraordinary. Doesn't get you out of living a human life with the challenges and the ups and downs and things like that, but it does make a lot of that way, way easier. Yeah. So there's the quiet again. And I think if I want to really convey anything, even though I haven't talked about it much tonight, it is the valuing of that quiet that's inside of you. Because the quiet spaces inside of us, initially they don't seem to offer much. It's like you go into a quiet room. It's quiet. It might be nice because it's quiet. But you're not being showered with anything. Nothing's being given to you except quiet, right? Which is, of course, nice. And it can feel like that when you first start to experience some of your own inner quiet. I've had people say, well, what's the big deal, Adya? Like, okay, it's quiet. Great. Like, so what? And I'll say, like, yeah, okay, so what? Hang out with it. That quiet might reveal a whole hell of a lot more than you ever imagined. So I hope you do please continue to value the quiet spaces inside yourself, the heartful spaces. And it's been wonderful sharing this time and this space with you, as it always is. So, what's coming up, my friends? Let me look at the announcements. Oh, I'm going to be doing the Sunday community practice on this weekend, Sunday, September 10th. So this Sunday. And that starts, what time does that start? Well, look on the internet. I do it all the time, so you'd think I'd know. But there's also a kind of a Sunday community practice, and then there's a sort of a pre-community practice meditation for those that want to do a little extra meditation before that. So just look on our internet, and you'll see all that stuff on the webpage. And the next Wednesday free live broadcast is going to be with Mukti on Wednesday, September 20th, it looks like. So Mukti will be here for September 20th on a Wednesday next time to be with you. And well, until Sunday, my friends, let's just dive into some of that quiet mystery of our being and take that curiosity in with us. There's more to us, each of us, than we can ever imagine. Nice to be with you. Namaste.